Hi there, this is the third part on the series I'm doing on the knight f3 opening for atomic chess. In this video, I just want to quickly mention before I get into the main topic of this video, which will be on the move 3e3, a couple of things I forgot to mention in the first video, which was on the move 3h3. There's a couple of lines which I think deserve a mention, which I neglected to do. So after the first one is if the move e3. I recommended the line g6 and against bishop d3 to play f5. I stand by that. I think that's a very good way to play for black. But I forgot to mention this queen f3 move, which is kind of a dangerous move because immediately white is threatening both queen d5 and to sacrifice on f5 with one of the knight or the bishop. There are kind of two good ways I think to meet this, or at least two good ways. I mean e6 and e5. I had a game where I played e5 and I think it went quite well against Gran Lapin, who is probably the strong player that plays queen f3 the most. I mean, he's played it quite a few times with reasonable results. But I did quite well with the move e5. After this, queen b7, which is one idea of queen f3. I think bishop takes b7 is quite good for black, really. If the pawn was on e6, it would make more sense because then white could come back with the knight to f3 and threaten to come into e5 and g5. Although even in that case, I think black should be fine. But with the pawn on e5, it makes less sense because now this knight's not really threatening to come to e5 at all. So Gran Lapin didn't play that. He played knight c3, which is kind of a clever move because black can't take this knight because of queen d5 winning the game. And by the same idea, white is now threatening to hop with this knight into d5. So black has to do something about that, which I did with queen h4. Game went g3, queen takes g3. And now, again, of course, knight d5, e takes d4 is now possible for black. So white instead played knight e6, sacrificing a piece to get this active knight into black's camp. So black is a whole piece up here, but white has this strong knight on d5. I think it's kind of a fair enough trade-off. In fact, if anything, I'd rather be black. I played bishop g7, and GL continued with knight e7, which is a reasonable enough move. I think still, I still prefer black slightly, but that's probably better. I mean, if white does take on c7, which is possible, then the move e4 comes in, and white is temporarily a pawn up, but because of the threat on b2, after c3 he has to immediately give the pawn back, and now with the rook coming to c8 so quickly, black's definitely better here. So that's just what I want to say on the queen f3 move. It's kind of trappy, but if black knows what he's doing, then it's not really a big problem. The other thing I really wanted to mention was the move 4 knight f5. Now, the second video I did in the series looked at the move 3 knight f5, and you can see that there's quite a lot of similarities here. The differences are that obviously there's a pawn on h3 for white and a pawn on b5 for black, and I feel that that kind of trade-off is in black's favour, really. Again, Gran Lapin is the guy that's been playing this opening the most, although there have been a few other strong players that have played it. But the pawn being on h3 does make a difference, so my kind of general recommendation for black, the way to play in the previous videos, previous video was to play the moves d5 and e5. However, in this case, that would actually be a mistake because of bishop h6. Now, if I quickly just show a similar position in the position after 3 knight f5, you can see that without the pawn on h3, black actually has a good counter to this idea, which is bishop g4. And then after f3, protecting the queen, captures h5, preventing queen h5. And this black square bishop is really strong. It comes to h6 and then into d2, and black's actually doing quite well there. However, in this case, with the pawn on h3, that's no longer possible for black, because if after bishop h6 you play bishop g4, then simply white will take it with the h-pawn. So it's kind of preventing that defence. So black has to be careful to avoid that. I mean, it is possible to play d5 and then g6, but in this case I quite like e5. White's kind of got a bit more space, and I'd slightly prefer being white. I mean, it's not a big deal. Okay, you can play this for black, but instead there is a kind of nice idea, which is to play the move e5. Now if the pawn wasn't on h3, it takes advantage of the pawn being on h3, you see, because if this pawn wasn't here, white would have this idea of playing queen h5 and then bringing the queen back to g3, which would then win along this diagonal, because after f5 it would simply be e takes f5 with a standard tactic which wins for white. But now that pawn's there, that's no longer possible. So I've had a couple of games here. I mean, there are different move orders. White could play d4 first, and then e5, e4, either way is possible, and then g6. And this is quite rare. I mean, I've played this as black against Grand Lapin and Molten Thinker and had good results. And I think it's quite a nice way to kind of keep with the same kind of ethos of how to play with black. You know, get a hold in the centre and get this bishop out via g6, bishop h6, in the same way as the 3 knight f5 lines. So that's what I wanted to mention really, because I know those lines are fairly popular and you may well come across them in your games. Okay, so with that done, I'm going to move on now to 3e3. There's a lot of stuff to cover in this variation. My main recommendation here is to play knight g4. Before I cover that move though, I do want to mention that another possibility, which is c6. And this is a very interesting move, and I think if you like this move, then by all means go ahead and play it, because I think it's fairly sound. I think the only real test of its soundness is to move queen h5. And this is more kind of an objective problem than a practical one, because these variations are so complex. Play generally continues g6, knight b5, knight g4, and white has to move this pawn, let's say to f4. These positions are incredibly complicated. The only real people in inverted commas that can handle these positions are basically computers. In fact, in the a renaming of the atomic openings that was done some years ago by Siggy Mannon, this was called the in fact the whole e3 system, 3e3 move, was called the opossum Trojan Knight attack, which is a fairly apt name, because I think the only real playing entities that can handle these positions as white is the computer brain, because for a human the positions are just so random and the general tactics are really not like anything else that you come up in other openings. So it's not anything that people are going to have in their mind as kind of pattern recognition, which obviously computers don't have a problem with that because they evaluate every position on its own merits. But for a human to kind of play these positions, it's very difficult to quickly see the kind of relevant tactics. So in a practical game, I think this is possible. You can play with this with bishop g7 or bishop h6. Let's say bishop g7. Again, there's another branching with knight c7 check or knight a7. Let's say knight c7. And you get this position, and I think it's possible just to stop here and say the position's unclear. But I mean, that's an opening that you could delve into for a very long time and analyse lots of different variations, but it's all just, to my mind, just looks a complete mess, and any side could really win that. So if that's the kind of game you like, then I would go ahead and allow white to do that. But white does have another option, which is knight b5. If I was playing white here, this is probably what my choice would be, because it's a bit more sane, a bit more kind of understandable to my brain. The position's a lot more kind of standard, and you get the same kind of tactics that you get in other variations. In fact, after knight g4, f4, one of black's options is to take this knight. And after knight c3, not the only move, but probably the best move, e6, we actually transpose to a different variation. I'm not going to analyse this position here. If I do analyse this position, it will probably be via this different move order, which happens like this. I'm not going to talk about these moves right now, possibly in a separate video at another time. We reach by a transposition. Knight g4 first. We reach by transposition the same position that we just talked about. And I think black is under a bit of pressure here. Probably a way to avoid that, or probably a more accurate way via this particular move order. c6, knight b5, knight g4, f4, is to play queen a5. This was certainly the most popular move when this variation was played a lot by white. And here, probably blocking with the knight is a bad idea, because then this knight can go to f2 and d3, and white's in probably a bit of trouble there. So instead, white can block it with the pawns. So b4 is met by queen a4, and after the sequence, knight a3 takes, after all these exchanges, Black is actually material up. White can try and get some initiative going with this bishop, but really Black's king isn't really under threat. It can go back to g8, and Black is a piece up now, and should have good chances to win that game. So instead, the best move is c3. Now here Black has two moves, which I'd be prepared to kind of put my stamp of approval on. The first one is g6, and this is a very complicated line. The kind of justification behind this move is that after knight takes a7, knight f2, if this queen comes over to a4, then queen h5 does win for Black, because you're invading along this diagonal. While if White goes the other way, bishop h6 hounds the queen on f3 by attacking f4, and White's in trouble. Instead of knight takes a7, it's probably better to play knight c7 check, and then bishop a6. And these positions are really complicated. I've had a correspondence game on the site Scheming Mind against strong player Recursive when I was White in that game, and it was very difficult to kind of calculate all the lines, and there were lots of branching points. So it's hard. I'm not going to give a in-depth analysis of that line at all. It's quite rare as well, so it's not really worth it memorising it at all. But it's just knowing that that line's there leads to unclear play. Another option is to play knight f2. So this is saying I'm not scared of queen h5 check, which you allow that. And now knight c7, really the only move. King d8. So the good thing about this knight f2 line is that all the moves are kind of forced for Black. You don't really have many branching points. It's all just kind of up to White what he does. And here, in the fixed state space of games, all the games really were about queen moves. So queen c5, queen b5, or queen takes a5. So for example, queen takes a5. Black's really not under any pressure here. You can either play knight e4 coming to d2, or play knight a6. In either case, the position is quite balanced. Black isn't really in any more danger than White, certainly. But there is a more ambitious try for White, which is knight d5. The idea of this is that if this gets captured, bishop b5, and queen d5, and White wins. So instead, Black should play e5. But White shows his idea here, or a second point behind his idea, is knight b6, which wins the queen. However, that's not the end of the story, because after taking this knight, important to take with the a pawn, opening up the rook, White saves his queen, rook takes a2. And here you end up with a material imbalance where Black has two knights for a queen, but one of the knights is very active on f2, and the queen on h4 is going to come under attack by all the pawns and Black's pieces. So I think Black has definitely enough compensation here for the queen. So this is kind of an interesting try if you want to play this way. If I just back up now, so that was basically c6. I'm just going to give that as kind of like a second option. Perfectly playable, but I'm going to recommend knight g4 as my principal recommendation. And f4, kind of forced. And now here is the kind of move which I'm kind of proud of, because I think this is the kind of the line that I really introduced into practice, which has kind of scared a lot of people away from this 3-3 line, which has become quite rare with the top players these days. It's very, very infrequent to see it in practice. It used to be that c6 was the main move, but I've spoken in a previous video that I always prefer playing b5 over c6 if possible. It stops any knight b5 ideas, which again here transposes to a line we just looked at. But it's also better to play b5, I think, here for other reasons, in that if White goes for the main lines, which is where you grab this material on g7, we'll go through these moves again in a bit in more detail, but the point of the pawn on b5 is that if White tries to run with the queen, because his queen's short of squares, when his knight's going to hop into f2, he wants to escape with his queen and try to cause some havoc over here on the queen side. But the pawn on b5 does a much better job than the pawn would do on c6 at controlling that queen and really limiting its motion over there. So that's really the kind of thinking behind b5. So you're actually stopping knight b5 and also planning on preventing that queen's mobility over on the queen side. And so b5 is my recommendation. And here White has some other options. So the main line is knight f5, going for that, taking on g7. But there are some other options. So h3 is fairly common, especially I think among players that don't really know these lines very well, or kind of not really very experienced in the opening. And here e5 is quite a good idea. So white will probably take on g4, and now h5. And white does have a piece for a pawn, again a small material advantage, but black's more advanced pawns and kind of easier piece play, I think more at least compensate for that, probably more than compensate for the small material loss. Because I mean this knight will get taken if it doesn't move, and if it does, say to d5, black can simply play d5, opening up the bishop to go to g4, and you know black has a really good hold of the centre here, and I'd rather be black. So h3 isn't very dangerous. Apart from h3, white can try knight c3, but I think this is probably premature. It's probably better to play it on the next move after knight f5, e5. Because if you play it here, we'll cover this line a bit later on, but the pawn's already committed to e5. If you play it here, black can play e6 and control that d5 square. And it's difficult to see anything better for white here than to go into knight f5. When after h4, black simply has a good version of the main lines, so it's not really worth kind of going into this in much detail. I mean, white takes here, bishop b7 is a good move, and black's doing quite well, I think. So knight c3 isn't anything to be scared of. The only move that I would say is worth talking about here that has been tried by some good players is the move bishop d3. This has some kind of threats behind it. I mean, if black's not careful, say for example he plays e5, he can get hit by bishop f5, which is a very nasty kind of wake-up call, and in fact black's just completely busted here. So black has to be careful about that. The move I'd recommend is g6. I think this is the only good move. e6 has been played, but after bishop takes h7, g6, h4. I haven't been able to find a good line for black here. I think black's in big trouble. So g6 I think is best. And now knight f5 is really the only threatening move. Bishop f5 has been played in some games, but this is just toothless. I mean, there's no real... well, black's obviously fine here. I mean, there's no threats for white at all. So knight f5 is the only move that you should really be concerned about. However, after e6, knight g7, bishop takes. Despite the fact that white is a whole rook up, black's compensation with this knight on g4 is at least adequate, probably more than adequate in fact. It's very difficult for white to really deal with this knight. For example, let's say h3, you know, the knight was threatening to take on h2 possibly, or come into f2. But after f3, okay, so knight f2, queen f3, knight e4, a nice zigzag with the knight, castles, bishop b7. Black's doing incredibly well. In fact, I think black's winning here because of the threats of knight g3 and knight c3. That just shows kind of how quickly white can get into big trouble in this line. There are lots of other variations I've looked at here, but they all just end up with black doing quite well. I'm not going to go through them all because it's quite a rare line and you probably won't come across it very often, if at all. So that's it apart from knight f5, the big move, knight f5. So we'll cover that now. I recommend the move e5 in response to that. There was a time some years back where I kind of liked the move e6, however I don't feel it's quite as sound as e5. The reason for that is that the move e6 is kind of geared against white's ideas of evacuating to the queenside with c3, because it really blunts this diagonal. So if white tries to come in queen b3, he doesn't gain a tempo by playing queen b3, and the knight can come to d1, which is kind of nice, you know, having this, you're going to gaining a tempo on that line after e5. However, instead, white can play the move d4, which is very good, and it shows the advantage of e5 over e6 for black. In that e5 you actually pressurise the f4 pawn, which means that after knight f2, queen f3 is now possible for white. And this really helps white quite a lot. I think white's doing actually quite well here. Knight f2 perhaps is premature, but there was a key game I played some years ago when I was black against Trojan Knight, the strong engine, and I tried bishop b7, d5, knight f2, queen f3, and then I tried coming back to g4. This was my idea in that I thought maybe white had nothing better than a repetition going back to d1. However, Trojan Knight came up with knight c3, knight takes c3, bishop e3. And I have the feeling that white is basically objectively winning here. I think it's very, very good for white, especially against a computer like Trojan Knight that calculates all the kind of infiltrations with the queen and stops you from doing it. It was just a nightmare. I couldn't get any play at all. Against a human, it might be possible to give this a punt as black, because with the queen you always have chances and tactics flying around. So yeah, it might be worth a punt playing this line, but I'm not going to recommend it as my principal recommendation because I just don't believe it's actually quite sound. So I'm going to recommend e5. Now after e5, the main line is knight takes g7, but another very dangerous move is bishop d3. Bishop d3 here, and I'm going to cover this and knight takes g7 in the next video. In the remainder of this video I'm going to cover white's kind of less dangerous options. So one of those is playing h3 again. This really isn't too dangerous. So black plays h5, and really he has kind of like an improved version of the main line. As if white takes on g7, simply knight f2 is good for black. White can try some other moves, say for example knight e7 is kind of a try, and then knight f2, queen g4, e takes f4, knight takes c8, and now black has this idea of zigzagging knight into d2, and ends up white has a spite check, but black has a winning position. White can try some other things, but ultimately I think after h3 it's too slow and black actually ends up with a winning game. Another move to mention is knight c3. Here h5 is a very interesting try. Lots of very interesting lines here that I've looked at with knight d5, also knight e7, bishop d3. It's, like I say, it's very complicated, interesting line. However, it's probably not worth actually kind of knowing all that stuff for a line that's so rare, so I would recommend just playing d5. It's very simple, just blocking off this knight on c3, and white really doesn't have anything better than to play knight takes g7. So if white does play knight takes g7, then h5, standard way of playing, and here Trojan Knight has played this a few times by playing f5. Another option is to play f takes e5, and now this was played against me by Fargo Bear in on fix, and I played queen e7, so threatening to play knight takes e3, and after d3 I played knight takes e3, which was kind of a decent option for black. So knight takes e3 and bishop g4 is one possibility. Another option is to simply play f5. I think this is possibly even stronger, and black's basically winning this game, I think, after that move. So Trojan Knight instead plays f5, and the idea behind this is to allow the queen to now come out to f3. However, simply jumping in with knight f2 anyway seems kind of good. Queen f3. Now coming back to g4 is possible with a possible repetition, but I like knight e4. And after d4, knight d2. Bishop takes b5, e takes d4. And here there's a kind of strange material imbalance where white has an extra rook against two pieces, a rook and some pawns for two pieces. But white's queen is kind of misplaced and maybe it has to come back to d1, or maybe h3, it could possibly go to h3. But black has this strong knight on d2 and has really got good possibilities of invading with his pieces and opening up white's king, which is going to be stuck in the centre for a long time. So I really wouldn't be comfortable playing this as white, and I think black's doing very well, especially in a practical game. Okay, so that's it really for all the kind of sidelines. So that in the next video I'm going to cover knight takes g7 and bishop d3, which is kind of going to be my kind of tip for white. I think bishop d3 is a very dangerous move that's been very kind of underestimated up to now and has been quite rare in practice. So hopefully you come back and watch that video. Yep, so that's it for this. See you next time.